Have you tried a write and discuss activity in your classroom? Or are you hearing about this procedure maybe for the first time? No worries if it is, because in this episode, Ben Fisher-Rodrigues, a German teacher in Washington, joins me to talk about the benefits and logistics involved in implementing write and discuss as part of comprehension-based communicative language teaching. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to listen to teachers talk about teaching so that you can be confirmed about what you are doing in your classroom being on the right path, maybe even see something in a different way. Whatever that is for you, you're listening to a podcast about teaching, so that makes you an incredible educator. So thank you so much for being here. So today I'm going to be speaking with Ben Fisher-Rodrigues, and he is going to be telling us about this idea of write and discuss in the CI classroom. And this is a fairly new topic to me. So maybe along with some of you, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions about how I could possibly do this in my classroom tomorrow. So if you are familiar with it, you could say, oh, great, some good reminders, maybe in a different way I could do this. And for some of you like me, you're going to have something totally new to do in your class tomorrow or next week. So Ben Fisher-Rodrigues is a German and Spanish teacher in Washington State outside of Seattle. And he's been teaching for about 6 years. And in that 6 years, he has accomplished quite a bit. He is well on his way into the conference presenting world. He is already the Washington Foreign Language Teacher Association Teacher of the Year. That's the WAFLT, I believe is how you say it. It's one of those alphabet soup ways of going about all of our language organizations. And he's also presented at ACTFL, at CI Reboot, and Comprehended Online. At ACTFL, he presented along with some other German teachers on supporting LGBTQ+ students in the classroom. So he is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to not just this CI teaching stuff, not just this write and discuss, but also just being an all-around great teacher and supportive of his students. So I hope I did you justice, Ben, and welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. I am really honored by the invitation and happy to be here. If I may, can I put in some plugs for some other stuff that I'm involved in?
You can tell us about everything that would be helpful for us to know about you.
Great, perfect. So I am the current president of the Language Learner Literature Advisory Board. And so if any of your listeners are using classroom readers, there's sometimes called like CI readers or novelettes published by companies that specialize in this sort of thing. We provide feedback about how those readers represent identities in the texts, because we know that these convey not only language, but messages about people, messages about groups of people, countries, etc., cultures. And so I'm going to put a plug in WERARE, lab with 3 L's, LLLAB.org. And we have reviews of readers that are in German, in Spanish, in French. And I just wanted to put a plug in for that as well, because reading is really important to language learning. And we want to make sure that the readings that we're giving to our students are culturally sustaining and respectful and great and positive.
Okay, so I already have a question about that before we even get into our real topic here. Not our real topic. Everything's a real topic.
Yeah.
So how do you go about reviewing these books? Do you use a common rubric? What does that process look like?
Yeah, Lab uses a template that we developed from a variety of sources. I think Learning for Justice was one of the sources that we used. I think there are other book review templates that we drew from as well. The names are escaping me right now, but we kind of came up with one that is specific to CI readers. And we don't do starred reviews. It's not like, is this book good or bad? It is just describing what we see through our own personal biases and experiences in the books in terms of the representation of different identities. And this could be language identities, nationalities, gender and sexuality, how different socioeconomic classes are represented, whether or not there is representation of different body types, disability, that sort of stuff. So we use a template to kind of first just pick out what is in the text, and then we offer some analysis of what we see in that text.
We'll make sure that that is in the show notes, definitely, for everyone to reach out and find those things out. So thank you for doing that. That is an incredible resource, because the amount of times I can say personally that I've looked on a website, you see the cover, you see what the plot is, but to really have some insight on more than just the plot and what might happen and the word count and the number of unique words and stuff like that. Like, these readers are so much more than that. So thank you. My problem now is I'm going to go to the website and I'm going to go down a total rabbit hole and I'm not going to do anything else for the rest of the week. Thank you. Thank you for that.
I will also say we also always welcome feedback. We are imperfect people who read these books with all of our, personal biases and thoughts and stuff like that. And so we're always happy to hear if people have also read the books, if they had analyses and reactions to that, and if they took issue with the things that we say, we're happy to hear it. Yeah. And so I hope that is a good resource, and let me talk about it.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so now let's dive into our topic, this whole idea of write and discuss. But before we even get there, and people who listen to this podcast and know my style, they know that I always like to start by making sure that we all understand what it is we're talking about first. So in your classroom, you engage in or use a technique known as Comprehension-Based Communicative Language Teaching, or CCLT. So can you tell us how you interpret this approach and what it looks like in your classroom?
Yeah, there's a lot to it. I wouldn't profess to be an expert, but I would say that my knowledge of CCLT, Comprehension-Based Communicative Language Teaching, is built on the idea that students acquire language through input that is embedded in communicative events. So that means that we're having real conversations about something, we're trying to exchange information to get to know each other, we're learning about something about each other in the world. The way that language is going to be expressed and interpreted by students is going to be developmental. So they're going to go through stages. It's in the beginning. They might be outputting single words or just pointing at stuff, thumbs up and down. And then that communicative ability is going to increase over time with lots of rough, bumpy patches that we're all aware with. So I think for me, what that looks like in my classroom is asking myself every day. I think you just had your fabulous series with Maris Hawkins and Florencia Henshaw, is, what information is being conveyed and what are we going to do with that information? Because I think that sets us up to ask, what is really the communicative purpose of this? Are we communicating, or am I talking at my students? Am I telling them things about the language, or are we using the language to do something? And so CCLT for me is making sure there are communicative events happening in the classroom, and then the first C, comprehension-based, is ensuring that students are understanding what's going on. So providing lots of scaffolding and comprehension checks to make sure that comprehension is happening. So the input can do its input magic.
Can you give us an example of what a communicative event is?
It could really be anything. And again, it kind of goes back to what is the purpose for communicating? Am I just trying to ask about a student and their life just to build a relationship with the whole class? So if I am using personalized questions about what people did over the weekend, that's a communicative event, as long as I'm reacting to it in a way that is communicative. If I'm like, write 2 sentences about your weekend, and then we don't do anything with that information, then that's not very communicative. They have expressed some meaning to me, and I didn't communicate with them. Yeah. And where if I ask natural follow-up questions, if I make comparisons and contrasts to build relationships in the classroom, that's a little bit more communicative. We can also, read a text together about a cultural phenomenon and discuss it and compare it to our own cultures and see what are the commonalities. And that's real communication. That's interpreting a text and then having spontaneous, thoughtful, personalized communication about that. So communicative event can kind of just be anything, as long as people are communicating with purpose.
So it comes down to that question 2 of Henshaw and Hawkins in Common Ground about what is communication, where the first thing is what is being communicated. We're all really good at that. But then what is being done with what is being communicated? So that's the part that makes it a communicative event.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of the CI techniques, the idea of comprehensible input. There's so many techniques and approaches and procedures that are going on out there with it. And so I wanted to focus in on one of them today. So one of these techniques or procedures in CCLT, as we refer to it, the Comprehension-Based Communicative Language Teaching, there is this thing that we refer to as write and discuss. Now, I've seen, because I've read all of your blog posts on it and seen everything that you've talked about, that you have considerable experience with this. You are like the how-to manual person for this. So what is this essentially, this idea of doing a write and discuss, and why is it beneficial for students?
Some other names that exist for write and discuss also kind of reveal what it can do. Sometimes people call it shared writing. It's not that the teacher is doing all the writing for the students or that the students are doing the writing by themselves, but that the teacher and the students are sharing the writing together as part of the creation of it. I know it comes from the language experience approach, and I think that speaks also to that we have had some sort of experience with the language, and now we are making it more concrete. What it basically is having some sort of experience as a class, and that could be a lot of things. We'll talk about what those could be, I'm sure, but having some sort of language experience with the class, something that you all do together, and then you prompt the students that you're going to write a summary text that highlights everything that we learned together as a class or the things that we discussed. And so what you're doing is you're creating a level appropriate text based on the comprehended experiences that you had with the students in the class that you can use for a variety of literacy purposes. And in the creation of it, you're kind of wrapping up all four skills into one. The students are talking and discussing what they already discussed to decide what's most important or what needs to be included, trying to upgrade details. They're listening to each other. They're listening to the conversation as part of that. The teacher obviously is modeling the writing for the students, and then you have a text to reread. And so it kind of wraps any sort of language experience a class has had all together, a discussion, any sort of text, whatever a text is, a movie of whatever it is, a story that's been read. It wraps it into kind of like a summary experience that itself can also be used for furthering literacy.
And so when you say that students are then writing this summary text, this is something they're doing individually?
Write and discuss is a procedure for the teacher to model strong writing technique in the language that is kind of at or slightly above your I+1, if you will. Mm-hmm. Writing skills.
Hashtag crashing.
Hashtag, he's crashing this podcast. Yeah, it's a way to model those writing skills. Sometimes when you have a class and you have a discussion that's a little bit more open, or even sometimes our students respond in surprising ways to videos or texts, that is like improvised. It's almost like jazz. And then that write and discuss is you putting that jazz onto sheet music. So that like if you wanted to hear that solo again, then you could. So it's a way of like summarizing, but the teacher models that. And so taking it and turning it into, again, level appropriate because it's based on the experience that the class has had before, where there's been comprehension checks, where there's been checks for understanding, kind of like you just podcasted about it, just listen. That has all been happening along the way. And then in the end, the teacher models how to create an appropriate text out of that experience.
Now I want to do this in my classroom. I'm excited. I want to have a communicative event like no other. And so let's talk through the logistics so we can really see what this looks like in the classroom. So however that's going to be easiest to tell us about the logistics.
Sure. So you've done just about anything as a whole class. So you've had an interview, you've looked at an infographic, you've read a text together, then you've done some discussion of it, done some personalizing of it. Then you want to get ready to have that modeled writing for students to see. And so I typically tend to write on my own whiteboard, just the whiteboard at the front of my classroom, for a couple reasons. And then it kind of slows me down, which is helpful. I can get a little bit ahead of myself if I start typing. But I think writing on the board kind of models that. And you can, German has umlauts, the little dots above stuff, and a different character. And so I like to model that like, oh, this is how you would write it by hand. So that's kind of nice. You could do the same thing on a doc cam. You could just get a piece of paper and write on a doc cam for students to see. You could also type directly into a Google Doc or a slide. I know, for instance, Diane Neubauer is a CCLT teacher who she calls it live typing as well, where she's typing, I believe it's pinyin that turns into Chinese characters. And so if you type up, you can also show how to type and maybe get special characters if they're necessary for French, for Spanish, for German. Typing in other languages, I'm sure, is a fun adventure that you can model through that.
This is something that you're doing in real time, so that you haven't prepared this in advance that you're showing them. This is happening in real time. That was my first logistics question. Okay.
Yes. I think that there is a certain amount of our instruction that almost needs to be left to chance because kids are human beings and they're going to have big human, real human, normal human reactions to the stuff that they learn, to the stuff that they experience in their class. And so, yeah, there is no way to know what they're going to say on any given day, as I'm sure you're fully aware. And you can take what they give you and roll with it. And then, turn it into a text. And I think that's another cool thing too, is that like sometimes we have heritage speakers in our class. I very rarely get heritage speakers of German, but I actually do have a couple right now. And kind of a cool thing to do to honor them is they can also help write some of the text. So they could be at your computer typing it up while you're writing on the board, or they can be writing it for you or something. I think the important thing again is that you have had some sort of experience that does encapsulate a lot of learning for them, and that you have it in a format that's savable and shareable, because that text that you create, because it is on level with the student's experience in the language and modeled by you, is something that can be really powerful for future use. My phone is full of pictures of my own whiteboard with just like my handwriting being like, today we learned that so-and-so has a fish, so either taking pictures of your whiteboard or making sure it's on some sort of document forevermore.
Right. So you're going through and you're writing this, and I guess the length of what you're writing is going to depend on the proficiency level of the class. If it's novice level, it might be 2 or 3 chunk sentences. Going all the way up through like AP, you could be doing a full-on paragraph about something. So as you are writing this up there, are you doing sort of a question and answer with students? How are they helping to co-construct what you're writing?
That's a great question. I typically start it kind of panning out to the class to let them know, because it's kind of unusual. It's like a weird thing. All of a sudden the teacher's like, tell me what to write. And the kids are like, you're the teacher, like that. So I typically kind of start them off with like, we're going to write a summary of what we talked about. Like we talked all about people's hobbies, or we're going to talk about going to a restaurant. We're going to talk about the kinds of housing in our area or something like that. And so kind of getting them to like in that mindset, like we're writing a summary of what we learned today. So let's kind of show off what we learned. And sometimes I give them a sort of a starting, like I might, if we talked about a specific kid, I might say that kid's name and then just kind of wait and see what they come up with. If I'm trying to model some sort of writing style specific, you mentioned AP, that's a great example, is that you could model the essay, you could model any of the written responses, the email responses would be a great one to model as well. So you can start them with kind of the form of it and then kind of like pan out and be like, oh, what happened? What did we learn today? And I think it's really awkward in the beginning. I'm going to give you that like at first they're going to be like, I have to what? And especially if they're feeling uncomfortable yet like kind of talking out loud in the language. I think it's really important at any level to kind of accept L1 and L2, and then like I tell my kids that Denglish, Deutsch, English, or German English is like perfect. Like just like if you say all the words in a sentence and then one of them is randomly in English, I'm going to pretend it never happened, because ultimately what you're going to do is take what they say and kind of reformulate it into quote air quotes proper language, right? So I just like it being like, yeah, tell me anything, like literally what we learned about so-and-so. And sometimes, again, like at the early levels, like you said, the proficiency level of students doesn't make them feel like they can be like, oh, so-and-so likes to photograph nature and so-and-so plays the guitar in a band. And so they just say it in English. I repeat that in the L2, and because we've talked about it, that has already been established. I can repeat it for them in the language, and then we can maybe add more details based on more student responses.
That sort of answers a little bit the question I had in mind. When it comes to structures, students are saying certain things, and depending on the level, they could be inaccurate. There could be inaccuracies in there. And clearly what you're going to write up on the board is going to be your accurate interpretation of their phrase. I was originally going to ask, do you just use the vocabulary they're providing? But then you said if they say it in the L1, you'll translate it to the L2 and use it that way. So can we just unpack a little bit what they say ends up on the board? What does that look like?
That's where you do have to be careful, but I think there are ways to navigate that, because sometimes they will say like, sometimes you learned a lot that was not in the language, right? A kid pop tells a wild story and you're like, oh, I think you don't want to add too much new language, but you can get a lot of mileage out of. I literally just lean in and I go, "You guys want to learn a cool German word?" And the kids never say no. Like unless they're totally like disengaged from life and just like trying to lie down during class, like they're always like, "Yeah," and it's always just like because it's like not even that cool, but they're like, but like I just try to pan out and be like, "There's a word that would go right here and would make the sentence sound way more natural." But we don't know it yet. Do you want to learn it right now? And they're like, yeah. And so that's when you would try to plug in words, I think, that have high interest. I think Krashen talks about compelling input too, that sometimes things are more acquirable because they are compelling for some reason, like how people acquire swear words so quick because they're emotionally charged and interesting. And so I think if you have something, a kid has said something and the kids really want to learn gravel pit or something, like something super random. That's a literal word that came up the other day in my class. Or if you're like, hey guys, because would fit perfectly right here, then they're like, oh, sweet. Yeah, awesome. I wanted that word and it was there right when I wanted it. And so you can incorporate new vocabulary. I would caution against using too much new vocabulary, but you wanted to make it sound natural.
So you've co-constructed this text together, and then what do we do with it?
I'm always trying to check myself. I'm like trying to pause and reread it out loud for kids to hear to make sure we didn't miss anything. And then ask the class, did we miss anything? And if we did, we can add more stuff. We can parentheses it in, or we can put it at the end or whatever. Teachers have different relationships to whether or not they have the kids copy it. Some teachers have their students copy it into a notebook directly or in specific paper. I have mine all in a Google slide. And that is available on my students' course website. And so I just let them read it there if we're going to read it, or I can print it directly off the slide if we want to use it as a text to read in our hands. Afterwards, I think, again, you want to read and reread it. It is based on an experience that the kids had, but it is very satisfying to see the text of whatever. And so it could be you reading in the language to model pronunciation, to model the flow of the sentence, to model what it sounds like, and to kind of give that repetition. And again, because it's language they've experienced, it's just kind of more good input that they're like, I do know this and I feel good about this. You could do a choral reading. There's nothing wrong with a choral reading just for funsies. You could do a dramatic reading just to be stupid. I am a huge fan of, reading in silly voices. You could, I often have my kids translate it into the L1, especially if we've added kind of these like bonus words that start getting a little beyond the scope of what I was shooting for. But this also helps reestablish the meaning and gives kids another good run through of the language. And I think that German word order gets very funky compared to English. And so that's a good place to notice that. After we've done that, I just ask kids, like, what do you notice about how German works? Like, if you look at this text, what's something you notice? And in the first couple of meetings, they're like, oh, nouns are capitalized. Or like, that word order got weird. And I'm like, good, yes. And sometimes they point out other stuff. Sometimes they point out adjective endings, or sometimes they point out conjugations. And that's nice for them to kind of discover that on their own, as opposed to top-downing and just like beating them over the head with it. That's been really nice. At the end of the day, you have a text that they know and that they know well. So you can do a lot of stuff with it. You can have them illustrate it. You can dramatize it. You can quiz them on it orally in writing, do like another day, or just kind of separately have them correct the errors in sentences based on the summary. You could take it and do a horizontal conjugation. So taking things, for instance, if a story was told about a character in the third person, having a rewriting from their perspective. And you could have that text be kind of the base layer for an embedded reading. So a more complex reading that has maybe more complex word order or denser vocabulary or longer sentences. Have that be the initial super well understood text that then can kind of onion out into a variety of other purposes.
Excellent. Before you even start this with students, would you do sort of a graphic organizer outline of the ideas so students have that and then use that to co-construct the writing? Or does that seem like an unnecessary step?
That is a strong literacy move, I think, in general, is graphic organizers are like huge, like literacy help. It provides a lot of scaffolding and support. I think especially for something like the AP essay or something like that, if you're modeling writing the essay, then that is like super powerful. And I think the creation of the graphic organizer is also a way to review the information that makes the diving into writing the text more seamless and also easier. Because if they fill out a Venn diagram about two people that got interviewed in front of the class today, or a Venn diagram about German this, America that, or whatever, our community this, that community that, I think that can be a strong scaffold to then look at and say, how can I turn this into a summary text that is in a certain format. So maybe it's an informative, maybe it's an expository writing sample, maybe it's a persuasive, maybe it's whatever you need it to be. I use it a lot with my level 1s and my level 2s. The experiences that we're having are a little bit more sheltered. And so I think that the scaffolds are often either the things we've written on the board or the images that we're using to discuss. So it can be both.
But at any rate, they're having access to some of the words and or the input that you've been referring to throughout whatever the event was that you were doing prior to this.
And I use that as a scaffold sometimes if I've written words on the board, like we learned so-and-so has a lizard or whatever, and I wrote lizard on the board in English in the L2. Then sometimes when we're like, what did we learn about so-and-so? I kind of suggesting it to like look up at lizard and just like, that's interesting, and try to, get the kids to remind themselves like in what context it came up and how they could put it into a sentence. That's great scaffolding.
I think that there are going to be two schools of thought on this, when it comes to sort of the CCLT, the CI classrooms, where you don't do focused input. You're not specifically putting something in there that you hope the students are going to notice. Like you are specifically putting a lot of adjectives in say, the masculine form so that students notice it. Or you just organically, whatever they come out and see what they notice. I don't know where you land in terms of whether you should do that focused input or focused output, but what are your feelings with that and what have you tried with that?
I'm in a live your life camp of CCLT. People have different goals, and some people are a little bit more off the cuff and can get away with that to a certain extent and are familiar enough with teaching the language that they can, point out all the things they want to point out in a way that works. I am very type A planner type. And so I do a bit of focus, like I really want to make sure we hear this today, or I want to make sure like this verb just happens to come up, like oopsies. So I think you can do it either way. I don't think there's no rules. The write and discuss police are not coming. It's fine.
The write and discuss police.
There are none. We're all too busy.
Yeah. I'm also looking at an extension using it with PACE, where you could use that text and you might find it was not your intention going into it, but there are enough of a particular structure that came out that you can then highlight that. And they know the text so well because they helped in constructing it that it's now just focusing on how the structures came out in there. So I'm starting to put all the pieces together.
Oh yeah, totally. And I've done like at a low level 1, like just doing personal interviews about kids' hobbies and stuff like that, to draw out like, oh, that's really interesting, and like infinitives basically, right? Like, they all end in R. Bet there's something to that. Anyways, like, just like move on. But that totally 100%, I think it would lend itself well to a PACE style lesson.
Well, you have clearly had a lot of experience with this write and discuss. So I'm guessing you might have a couple of pro tips for us.
Thanks for asking, Joshua. I sure
it's almost like I've seen your website.
MrFisherSays.com. That's right. Yeah, I think my pro tips are, when I first started doing this, I think because I was accepting the discussion as it came from the kids, right? I'd get, for instance, if we like co-created a character or a story and they were like, it's blue, it's big, I would be writing sentence after sentence that was very just like, it's blue, it's big. I think ultimately we would want students to output language that's a little bit more naturally flowing than that. And so use natural language with them, connect the things, make lists of adjectives. It is blue, big, and bleh, whatever. So using natural language, and that kind of plays into what we talked about earlier of like, want to learn a cool word, is that sometimes the kids are like, it would be really cool if I could say this word right now, and it would totally make sense. There's no reason to withhold that word if you can establish the meaning of it and then be like, look, it perfectly connects all the things we were talking about. Use that natural language. To as much as you can, let students do it too. And I think that they will generate a lot of the like, today we learned about this, I think this about this. If you're scaffolding the language input for them to have that and giving them maybe discussion phrases that they are able to, we thought that was very interesting, or this many % of our class does this, or whatever it is. It's really cool to hear that come from them. And again, you can reformulate in whatever you need to. Have scaffolds generally, it could be images on the board. It could be words that you've written up during the period. Use punctuation, and talk about punctuation. That's a little thing that's easy to miss, but how do you say comma? How do you say period? If you want to put in a colon or a semicolon, if you're feeling wild and crazy. My ultimate pro tip on this one is don't feel the need to have the text you generate be perfect. I've had classes where I'm like, we didn't even talk about this whole thing. Like, we will talk for 20 minutes about one thing. And then the write and discuss text was like, we learned that Jim has a dog. And I'm like sitting there like, please, like, mention all the cool stuff we talked about. The text itself doesn't have to be perfect. You can guide the students towards writing more because you're the one writing, obviously. Like, you can guide them towards whatever you want. But if this was compelling to them and they want this to include this in the text, that's great. You can go back later as the teacher and make executive decisions about what needs to be in the summary text. And you can, zhuzh it up and include the stuff, the cooler vocab or the new information that we just forgot to put in, or the dialogue that we had that was really funny, or whatever it ended up being. I've ended up with a lot of imperfect texts where I'm like, this sentence would be better here, and this would, like, once you have the text, you can move that sentence around as much as you want. You can do whatever you want with it. You can make it a way longer text than it originally was. Don't feel the need for the text to be perfect. Just generate a text and enjoy the experience of co-writing it with your kids.
And don't forget to zhuzh it up.
And zhuzh it up. Give it some zhuzh, Joshua.
That's my takeaway. Well, I remember in graduate school studying psycholinguistics, and they said there's going to be a point when you're going to just.
Was it Michael Long who said zhuzh it?
Zhuzh it up. Zhuzh it up. Okay, so I'm ready to go and try this tomorrow, which I've never actually done. So I'm feeling really inspired to do this right now. So while we're talking about such inspiration, where does your inspiration for all of this work continue to come from?
I get so much inspiration from online blogs, from books, website conferences, like the whole, I try to take advantage as much as I can, and I am very privileged to be able to do so. I think I have learned so much from like teachers who post blogs and then YouTube videos. And so I'm just going to shout out some names that I'm huge fans of. I'm a huge fan of Mike Pito. Mike Pito's a wonderful, great presenter. I've learned so much from him. Sarah Breckley, fantastic YouTube channel, lots going on. And they've both posted about Write and Discuss Mike a lot, and I know Sarah has as well. I also get a lot of inspiration from teachers like Adriana Ramirez and Alina Filipescu. I watched their YouTube videos literally on the plane on the way back from ACTFL, and I was like, what am I doing? Like, I'm trying to sleep, but I just get so inspired by watching them teach. And so those are the names I want to shout out right now.
So I just made a list of all of the future guests for the podcast. Thank you for that.
Yes.
Just writing those down.
All of them. They are all fantastic. Do it.
I'm actually looking forward to this right now. This is the point in the conversation where I like to pull the teacher curtain back a little bit and get to know Ben, not Benjamin, mind you, but Ben, Hair Senior Mr. Fisher. We're talking. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to give you a this or that. Choose one of them. If you want to say why, all good, but nothing too challenging, I hope. You up for it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. First one. Are you playing the musical instrument, or are you there to listen?
Recently, I am there to listen, but I did a lot of singing, like choir singing, professional singing in college. And every time I go to one of my little high schoolers' performances, I was like, I want to sing, man. So I think in my heart, I'm on that stage. In reality, I'm sitting in the audience crying about yesteryear.
Well, I think it's time to dust off those vocal cords and get back out there.
They do need some zhuzhing. Thanks for
zhuzhing. Oh, of course. Or zhuzhing. Why didn't I say that first? Okay. All right, the next one. It's a food question. Do you want the sit-down meal in the restaurant that has all those flavors you've heard about, or are you going to get the street food that is what the people are eating?
I think I'm a street food kind of guy. I have no guilt and shame about anything food related. I'm trying to get rid of that. And so I'm like, what are people eating? What's good? What are we doing? Mm-hmm. And so I love me a nice restaurant, but street food all the way, man.
Nice. Do you have a favorite particular street food that you've had that you can remember?
In Germany, I don't know if it's quite, I guess I get a street food. I ate a lot of Döner, which is a lot like gyro. It is, shaved meat in like a bread pocket, essentially. Mm-hmm. I ate a lot of that in Germany. And Currywurst, which is with curry ketchup. So usually ketchup with curry powder on top of it. Delicious. And then in the United States, I am a street taco fan. Okay. Tacos in any form.
Mm-hmm. So like food trucks, are those big where you are?
Not as much where I am now. I used to live in Texas, and in Austin, Texas, there were food trucks as far as the eye could see. Right. Less so in Seattle now, but yes, still.
Food trucks. Yeah. See, when I talk about street food, that's a lot of what I'm thinking of these days is the food trucks.
Yeah.
The good stuff there. Okay. Now the last one. Sand or snow?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think very split, like almost evenly split, but I had a really magical experience living in Germany. And that was like my first, because I'm from California, that was my first real like extensive snow experience. And it was months long. And there was something magical about it. I enjoyed kind of the rituals of putting on boots and stuff. And so I really like snow. It's actually very snowy here in Seattle right now. And so we're currently living in that. And I like it. I do love the beach though. I don't know, but I'll say snow. We'll say snow.
You're going to go with snow. Excellent. Yeah. Well, I'm sure that there are teachers listening to us right now that would like to reach out to you, maybe read more about you on your blog. Where can we get in touch with you if we want to talk more about this particular topic or maybe something else, maybe about street food?
Send to your street food related inquiries at mrfishersays.com. That is my blog and website. That's where I blog about issues related to world language teaching. So mrfishersays.com. I am on Twitter at mrfishersays. I will sync with that ship probably if it goes down. And another plug for We Are Lab with 3ls.org. Those are probably the main places where you can find me.
Excellent. And before we say our goodbyes, could you leave us with some hearty advice about taking on this write and discuss procedure in our classroom?
It says a lot about you as a teacher that you're willing to try something new, no matter what level of experience that you have. So go easy on yourself and know that whatever you end up doing, it'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. And if all else fails,
zhuzh it up.
Zhuzh it up. There we go. Thank you so much for being with me here today, Ben, for everything you shared and for doing it with such grace and humor. Thank you so much.
It has been my honor, and it's been really a pleasure to be on the podcast. Thanks for having me, Joshua.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Ben Fisher-Rodrigues? The concept of write and discuss was new to me, but now I'm looking forward to trying it out for sure. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Ben. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.